So let's talk about the New Orleans Saints and Heath. With Derek Carr retiring, who do you want to see be the quarterback of the Saints this year?
Oh, I think we ought to let everybody have a turn. Maybe just rotate one every quarter, or it'd be great to see Taysom Hill in that role. I don't really care. They're going to be a bad offense. The passing game is going to be, I would say, mediocre at best. And one of Tyler Shough or Spencer Rattler is probably going to start the majority of the games. I would be really surprised if a quarterback starts 17 games for the Saints this year.
What do you think about Rodgers or Cousins? Do you think that's a possibility for them?
I don't think. I'm very much more skeptical on Rodgers than it seems like everyone else is. But I don't think Rodgers or Cousins are going to be better or significantly better than Shough or Rattler.
Wow. Okay.
Aaron Rodgers hasn't been good for 3 years.
Did you see Spencer Rattler and Jake Haener play last year? Like, come on, he's so much better than that. Now, they could obviously get better, but Rodgers is so much better, so much more competent than that. And even Cousins is. I mean, they were horrible, those guys last year, like embarrassing. And Shough is going to be a 26-year-old rookie who completed about 62% of his passes in college, which is
it would be the dumbest thing in the world if the Saints, with the current state of their roster, decided to go spend a significant amount of money or draft picks on Aaron Rodgers or Kirk Cousins. They're going to be bad regardless.
It would be money. It wouldn't be much in the way of draft picks. And that's why I don't think Kirk Cousins is going to be really an option. Why would the Falcons want to try and help their division rival? Rodgers already said he's willing to play for like $10 million, and maybe the Steelers were just sitting back thinking, all right, that's what it's going to cost us. And the Saints can go, well, wait a minute, what if we offer you $12 million? And it wouldn't be that bad on the Saints cap. The real issue, though, is like, what's New Orleans doing? Like, they're a mess cap-wise. They always are. They've got a team that's not going to compete. I think if Aaron Rodgers goes there, they'll be on the fringe of competing, and Rodgers will be in the NFC, and maybe that helps him have a clearer path to the playoffs than if he's in Pittsburgh in that beat-up division in the AFC North. They'll be in trouble there. If I were him, I'd rather go to New Orleans. But it's not like the Saints are going anywhere either way. And so if the Saints realize that, they just give the job to Shough, let him obviously earn it. And if Rattler's better, then so be it. But this is starting to look more and more like an offense that I am scared to touch. And, Adam, you sent out a note with all the details on how bad bottom five offenses are. This makes me scared for a lot of Saints players.
Yeah, so bottom five offenses over the last 4 seasons. And last year I took the bottom 6 offenses. There was basically a tie for 5th worst between Jacksonville and the Raiders. And there have not been any standout wide receivers until last year when we had Neighbors and Brian Thomas. By far the best wide receivers over the last 4 seasons on bottom 5 offenses. Running backs, a little bit of a different story. We've had some good ones. Derrick Henry had a top 4 season a couple years ago with Tennessee on a bottom 5 offense. Breece Hall, twice really with Breece Hall, once overall, once per game. Jonathan Taylor was like top 12 per game 1 year if you remove one game where he played like 1 snap. And who was the other one? Saquon Barkley with the Giants a couple years ago. But there has not been in the last 4 years a bottom 5 offense that's given us 2 great fantasy options. So I would not recommend anybody draft both Olave and Kamara unless you're getting great value here. But I mean, would anybody be surprised if this is the worst team and worst offense in the NFL?
No.
They're in the conversation, but there's, certainly other competition. I wouldn't be surprised if what?
How does that change things for Kamara? Like, let's say Kamara has been a 4th round pick in our drafts. We always knew there was a possibility, or for a little while, we've known there's a possibility that Derek Carr misses the season. Now we know it's definitely happening. They did draft Tyler Shough. Like, does this change anything for Kamara and Olave right now and Shaheed? Or have you been drafting them thinking it's just going to be a disaster?
I mean, Olave's been on a slow sliding scale down for me to begin with. It's not just the quarterback situation. It's his lack of consistent production. It's the health risk of the concussions that he's dealt with. And so we talked about this on last Wednesday's show about the group of wide receivers, basically from like 24 to 40. He's still in that group. So I think he's still a number 3 receiver. But he's, closer to the back end of that than he was, at the start of this process, at least for me, where, I was hopeful of lack of target competition, which has really been the case. Shough coming back, but there's really not a lot of other players to worry about, even with the addition of Brandon Cooks, who's going to be 32. It's a terrifying situation. So Kamara's 31 or 30 years old, right?
30.
He's been extremely productive in the format that matters most for most leagues, which is PPR. And so even half PPR has still been very productive. But the lack of touchdowns are even more alarming now. The rushing production is probably going to be among the worst of his career again, because I just don't imagine them making him a workhorse to that level that we need him to be that type of rusher. He's never really been that. And then again, just at this point in his career, they did bring in somebody else to have some level of competition. So we'll see how that goes. But the offense as a whole, his age, he's I haven't really moved him too much yet, but it feels very much like, at least the way I'm thinking about it, like between a few of the rookies, Genti obviously notwithstanding, he's been going ahead of, he will go ahead of Kamara in every draft. Now Harvey and Hampton and Henderson, like, he's in that range, and that's, back end RB2, which is, probably still going to be good value, but I don't think round 4 is where you want to touch him.
I just think for me, it's two totally different situations, and the Kamara one's much, much harder than the Olave one. Because it wouldn't surprise me at all if they were a terrible offense and Alvin Kamara caught 85 passes and finished as a top 12 running back in PPR. I mean, he has top 5 upside in full PPR. We've got really no reason to believe that Chris Olave has that kind of upside. Like, he might be a borderline wide receiver too. He might be significantly worse. So it's easier for me to kind of pass on Olave, where he's been drafted most of the time. I have a hard time passing on Kamara in round 4, just because there's not very many players in round 4 or later that have the same upside. Jamie's right about all the risks with Kamara, but you don't even need a good quarterback for him to be good. You just need somebody that can throw the ball 5 yards.
Yeah.
Saw it last year.
Last year they were 24th in points per game. So it's not like they were very good. That was the worst offense that Alvin Kamara has been on. In games without Derek Carr, he just had very few carries in those games. He scored a lot of fantasy points. I think it's exactly what we're kind of hoping for, but the carries were so low. So they just were not really competitive. So Kamara, all right, I'll put you to the test right now. You said he's going to be in that group, but how many rookie running backs other than Genti would you right now today take over Alvin Kamara?
Again, for me, it's still just Genti, but that's kind of like where I'm leaning right now, is just to move him closer to those other guys, as opposed to he was firmly entrenched ahead of those guys, before the situation with Derek Carr arose. And as we could, you said we've been dealing with this for a few weeks now. It's a little nerve wracking, and I'll tell you, the last draft that we did, the Superflex draft, I was faced with this dilemma, and I kind of still lump him with the 3 guys that we talked about a lot last year, Joe Mixon or 2 guys, excuse me, Joe Mixon and Ken Walker. And I purposely drafted Walker over Kamara for one reason only, was the first running back I drafted was McCaffrey. I didn't want to put myself in the situation of 2 older running backs that, may have some concerns. So I went, just to sort of switch it up. Mostly because I view those 3 guys, Mixon, Kamara, and Walker, different ways that they're going to get their production, but high end, RB2s. That he's now behind those 2 guys. That's the one adjustment I did make. I put him behind Walker and behind Mixon, but haven't got to the point yet where he's behind, Harvey and Hampton and Henderson.
And
go ahead,
Dave. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going. In non PPR, I'll put Hampton ahead of Kamara, and I think it's easy, and I think we can work Harvey ahead of him, and maybe even David Montgomery. Not that Montgomery's a rookie. 4 games, you mentioned this, Adam, where there was no Derek Carr and there was an Alvin Kamara. He averaged 15.3 PPR points per game, at least 17 PPR points in 3 of them. He had 1 dud in the mix there. I almost feel like that's the range that you should draft. That's the expectation, is around 15 PPR points per game, unless they do something really dramatic at quarterback. And that's it. And so what's the range for that type of running back in full PPR? that's round 4. And I really wholeheartedly agree with Jamie. You don't want to lock up 2 old running backs with 2 of your first 4 picks. And so if you're going to settle for Kamara, maybe you're going 0 RB. Maybe you've taken Genty in round 1 or another younger running back in one of your first 3 picks. And then you double back for Kamara, hoping that he's better than 15 PPR points per game like he was last year. Terrible offense. You mentioned it. Still averaged 19 PPR points per game. And he scored 8 touchdowns. I don't think he scores 8 touchdowns this year, but it wouldn't surprise me. Heath said it, 85 catches, 85 divided by 17. That's got to be around 5. It's exactly 5.
Hey, about that.
Nailed it, Dave. And the other thing I was going to say was like the other complicating factor for Olave. And I think Rashid Shaheed still remains a great value no matter who the quarterback is because he just gets ignored in drafts. The first 5 weeks when both those guys were healthy, Shaheed had more targets, more receiving yards, more touchdowns, more fantasy points than Chris Olave.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know. It was weird. It was.
Did they pick up the 5th year on Olave?
Yes.
Okay. Because I was going to say, if they didn't, that's a trade candidate.
Well, I was going to say the same thing about Kamara. Like, this is something you should keep in mind. Like, he restructured his deal or had an extension last season. Like, it seemed weird at the time. It still seemed weird to me now. It seems weird to me now. Like, if there's a team that's in contention that wants to get a pretty significant piece, if he's still healthy,
Oh, yeah.
He's probably going to, be of some interest to some teams. I also wonder, like, he missed 3 games at the end of the season with a groin injury. At his age, it's just concerning.
The Saints will save $18 million if they cut him before next season.
All of my research that I've done
2026, I mean.
over the last few years has really pointed to this sentence, basically. Good offenses or the quality of offense matters more for wide receivers than it does for running backs. And that had really been true as I looked at the last 4 years of these terrible offenses until last season, which just bucked the trend. And you had 3 rookies. You had Neighbors, you had Thomas, and you had Brock Bowers, if you want to count him, who really excelled on terrible offenses. But for the most part, I mean, if you're worried about offenses, it does affect, and it makes sense, right? Like, it affects wide receivers more than running backs, because if running backs get that role where they just get so many touches, I think if you could look at Breece Hall. I'll just end on this. Breece Hall in 2023 was on the 3rd lowest scoring team in football. He had 223 carries, but he had 76 catches, and he scored 9 touchdowns. And
terrible quarterbacks.
Terrible. You could easily see that kind of stat line from Alvin Kamara.
But the difference is, again, he was coming off the ACL tear, but he was, 22?
Yeah.
Hey, Adam.
Yes, Dave.
I screwed up on the salary cap stuff with Kamara.
Go for it.
It's actually, they save almost nothing by cutting him before the 2026 season or the 2027 season.